The cab pulled up to the curb, and I sat there for a moment before getting out, breathing in the familiar smell of the neighborhood I'd grown up in. Cut grass, someone's charcoal grill 2 houses down, the particular stillness of a Tuesday afternoon in the suburbs. 7 months in Singapore will make you miss the smallest things. The way the light falls across a driveway in October, the sound of wind through oak trees that have been standing for 40 years. I had been dreaming about this moment since the day I boarded the plane. Then I looked up. There was a moving truck parked in front of my house. Not a rental, a commercial moving company with a logo on the side. 2 men in matching gray shirts were carrying boxes out of my front door, with the chipped brass knocker my father installed when I was 7 and loading them into the back with the mechanical efficiency of people who do this for a living. On the lawn, staked into the ground just beside my father's old rose bushes, was a real estate sign, not a for sale sign. A sold rider was already mounted across the top in red block letters. I didn't move. I just watched. Standing on the front steps, watching the men work, were my mother and my stepfather. My mother had a glass of white wine in her hand at 2 in the afternoon. My stepfather was on his phone, laughing at something, one hand in the pocket of his khakis like a man who had just closed a business deal and felt very good about it. My half-brother was sitting on the porch railing, scrolling through his own phone, wearing shoes that I recognized immediately as the kind that cost more than my first month's rent. My mother spotted me first. Something crossed her face, not guilt, not even surprise. It was closer to calculation. She took a slow sip of her wine, said something to my stepfather, and he looked up. His expression settled into what I can only describe as prepared indifference. He had rehearsed this moment. They both had. I got out of the cab. I paid the driver. I picked up my bag, and I walked toward them. My name is Claire. I am 31 years old. I spent 6 years building a career as a forensic accountant, which means I am professionally trained to find the thing people are trying to hide inside numbers that are supposed to look clean. I have untangled multi-million-dollar fraud schemes for federal agencies. I have sat across conference tables from men twice my age and age who believed they were untouchable, and I have watched their certainty dissolve in real time when I laid their own documents in front of them. I do not panic. I do not perform outrage. I follow the trail and I wait. I had been waiting for this moment since March. The contract in Singapore was legitimate, a 7-month engagement with an international financial compliance firm. I had been recruited specifically because of my background, and the compensation was significant enough that walking away was not a rational option. Before I left, I did what I always do when I'm going to be far away for an extended period. I assessed the risk landscape. And the risk landscape, if I was being honest with myself, had a very specific shape. It had my stepfather's face. He had been in my mother's life for 9 years. In those 9 years, I had watched him quietly reframe my father's memory as a burden, position my mother's grief as an obstacle to her happiness, and insert himself into every financial decision she made with the gentle persistence of water finding cracks in stone. He had never done anything I could prove. But I am a forensic accountant. I know what evidence of intent looks like before the crime is committed. So before I boarded that plane, I did 2 things. My mother walked down the steps to meet me on the lawn, her wine glass still in hand. Her voice was soft and careful, the tone she uses when she's decided that a difficult conversation is best handled like diffusing a bomb slowly, gently, as if the problem is my reaction rather than the situation itself. "Sweetheart," she said, "I know this looks jarring, but we need to talk." "Where is my furniture?" I asked. "Claire, the piano." My father's upright piano had been in that living room for 23 years. Where is his piano? My stepfather came down from the steps then, phone now in his pocket, performance of calm authority fully engaged. He was a man who had built his entire sense of self on the belief that he was the most reasonable person in any room. "Claire, your mother and I had to make a difficult call. Your brother needed capital for his business. He was in a serious situation. We had a limited window, and we had the power of attorney you signed before you left. We acted in your best interest." The phrase, "your best interest," landed like something foreign. I turned it over. "My best interest?" I repeated. "You were gone for 7 months. You don't use this house. It was sitting here generating property taxes and maintenance costs while your brother's business was collapsing. We liquidated a static asset to address an active crisis. That is rational resource management." That last sentence came out smooth and practiced. He had said it before, probably to my mother, probably more than once, until she accepted the vocabulary and stopped asking questions. My half-brother drifted down from the porch then, hands in the pockets of those expensive shoes, wearing the expression of someone who feels guilty but has decided that guilt is a less comfortable feeling than entitlement. It wasn't personal, he said. I was underwater, Claire. 240,000 in business debt. I didn't have anywhere else to turn. I looked at him for a moment. He was 26. In the 9 years our parents had been together, he had started and abandoned 4 businesses, each one funded by someone else's money, each one leaving behind a trail of unpaid vendors and casual shrugs. He was not a bad person. He was something more exhausting, a person who had never once been required to absorb the consequences of his own decisions. Did the sale close? I asked. My stepfather nodded. The buyer transferred funds this morning. 480,000. Cash transaction. Your brother's debts are settled. The remainder is in a joint account your mother and I set up. We'll discuss distribution once you've had time to. Who is the buyer? An investor. She purchases residential properties in this market for rental income. She was motivated, and she paid well over ask. The transaction is complete, Claire. I understand you're upset. But, is she still inside? A pause. She's doing a final walkthrough. I nodded slowly. I looked up at the house at the porch my father built with reclaimed wood, the summer I turned 10, at the window of the bedroom where I had hidden under covers with a flashlight and read until 3 in the morning, at the front door with the chipped brass knocker. Then I picked up my bag, stepped around my mother, and went inside. The investor was in the kitchen. She was probably 50, with the focused energy of someone who moved through the world efficiently and expected the world to accommodate her pace. She had a clipboard. She was making notes. When she heard me come in, she turned with a look that immediately categorized me as an inconvenience. You must be the daughter, she said. Your mother told me you might come by. The transaction is finalized. I need to finish the walkthrough, and then I'll need the property cleared. I looked past her at the kitchen. The table my father brought back from an estate sale was gone. The curtains my grandmother made by hand were gone. The shelf where my father kept his books, dog-eared paperbacks, organized by the completely personal system only he understood, was bare. What did you pay? I asked. That's not relevant to you. Who more me? She studied me for a moment, then decided it cost her nothing. 480,000. Cash. The funds cleared at 9 this morning. She tapped the clipboard. I need you off this property within the hour. I set my bag down on the kitchen floor. My stepfather had followed me inside and was standing in the doorway. My mother was behind him, wine glass now held with both hands, her knuckles pale. Can I ask you something? I said to the investor. Did you run a title search? She straightened. I buy properties quickly for cash. I work with a title company that does abbreviated searches on. Abbreviated, I said. Right. I unzipped the front pocket of my bag. The documents were in a manila envelope, the way I had placed them 7 months ago, before I drove to the airport. I had put them there specifically because I wanted to be able to reach them without digging. I'm going to tell you something that your title search missed, I said, because you abbreviated it. I opened the envelope and removed the top sheet. Before I left for Singapore, I transferred the title of this property out of my name. It is no longer held by Claire, the individual. My stepfather made a sound. My mother said my name, very quietly. I placed it into the Claire and Robert Harmon Family Trust, I continued, setting the certified copy on the kitchen counter so the investor could see it. The date stamp was 7 months ago. The notary seal was clear. The trustee designation was my name alone. My father's name was Robert. I added his name to the trust because this was his house and I wanted him in it in the only way I still could. I looked up. The power of attorney my mother gave my stepfather covers my individual financial accounts and my medical decisions. It does not extend to assets held inside a trust. He had no legal authority to sell this property. He had no legal authority to sign a sale contract. He had no legal authority to accept transfer of funds on behalf of the trust. The investor had stopped moving. She was looking at the document the way people look at something they want to be wrong. The deed your title company processed, I said, was signed by someone who had no authority to sign it. That makes the contract void. And because your funds were transferred across state lines based on that fraudulent contract, that transfer constitutes wire fraud under federal statute. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Then the investor looked at my stepfather, and the look on her face was one I recognized immediately. I had seen it in conference rooms, across deposition tables, on the faces of people who have just realized they are not the predator in the room. They are the prey. You told me, she said, her voice dropping to something very controlled and very cold, that you had full legal authority. You showed me the power of attorney. You represented yourself as having complete authority to execute this sale. My stepfather opened his mouth. $480,000, she said. The control in her voice was starting to fracture at the edges. That money came from my investment partners. That is not my personal money. Do you understand what you've done? I have a power of attorney, he said, and his voice had lost the practiced smoothness. There was something thin and exposed underneath it now. It's a general power of attorney. It covers all her assets. A general power of attorney over an individual does not grant authority over assets that the individual does not personally hold, I said. The house is not my asset. It is the trust's asset. I am the trustee of the trust. You would have needed a separate document granting authority over the trust, a document that does not exist. My mother sat down on the floor, not in a chair. On the floor, her back against the wall, wine glass finally empty. She looked very small. The investor called her attorney. While she was on the phone, I called mine a number I had pre-dialed into my phone contacts before leaving Singapore, the same way I had pre-packed the documents. My stepfather tried twice to speak, and both times I held up one finger without looking at him. My half-brother had come inside at some point and was standing near the back door with the posture of someone calculating exit strategies. Within 40 minutes, there were 2 police officers in my father's kitchen. The investor had given a statement. My attorney had emailed the trust documents to the officer's department contact. My stepfather sat at the kitchen table, my father's kitchen table, which the movers had apparently not yet loaded, and tried once more to explain that he had believed he had authority, that it had been a good faith error, that no one had intended any harm. One of the officers asked him if he had personally signed the sale contract. He said yes. He was placed under arrest for real estate fraud and wire fraud. The officer read him his rights in the kitchen where my father used to make Sunday pancakes, and my stepfather listened with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the performance of reasonableness still flickering even now, like a screen that hasn't realized the power has been cut. My mother didn't look up from the floor. It was my half-brother who surprised me. After the officers had walked my stepfather to the car, after the investor had gone outside to make more calls, my half-brother came to stand in front of me in the kitchen doorway. His face had shifted through several expressions and had landed on something I hadn't expected from him. Shame. Actual shame, not its performance. I knew, he said quietly. I knew the house was yours. I told him I wasn't sure it was right. He said the POA covered it. I wanted to believe him because I needed the money and it was easier to believe him. He stopped. That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. I looked at my half-brother for a long moment. He had never been cruel. He had only ever been weak, which is a different thing, though not always less damaging. The $240,000, I said. Is it gone? The debts are paid. I have about $18,000 left. You're going to need an attorney, I said. Not for criminal charges. But the investor will likely pursue civil recovery, and your name is attached to the stated purpose of this transaction. You should get ahead of it, he nodded. He looked like a 26-year-old who had just finished growing up very fast. I'm sorry, Claire, he said. About your dad's piano. I told them not to touch it. They did it while I was at the bank. I didn't respond to that. I wasn't ready to yet. Outside, the neighbors had gathered at a respectful but curious distance on the sidewalk. The Garcias from next door, Mrs. Pettigrew from across the street, who had brought me soup when my father died. The older couple at the end of the block, whose names I could never remember, but whose faces had been part of the texture of my life for 30 years. They watched the police car pull away. Mrs. Pettigrew caught my eye and gave me a small, slow nod. My mother was still in the kitchen when I came back inside. She had gotten up from the floor and was standing at the counter, her empty wine glass in front of her. She looked diminished, as if something structural inside her had been quietly removed while I wasn't watching. I thought it was legal, she said. He told me it was legal. You signed the power of attorney, Mom. He said it was standard. He said everyone does it when a family member travels for work. He said it was just for emergencies. Did you read it? A long pause. He said it was standard. I understood then that she was also a victim, not in the same way I was, but in a quieter and perhaps more permanent way. She had spent 9 years choosing to believe a man who made believing him the path of least resistance. That is not innocence, but it is not villainy either. It is something sadder than both. You're going to need your own attorney, I said, independent of him. Someone who represents only you. She looked up. He is going to try to make this about his defense, I said. He is going to need someone to corroborate his good faith. Do not let that someone be you. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where will you go tonight?" "I'm going to stay here," I said. "This is my house." The movers had to be called back. Half my belongings had already been loaded. The moving company's foreman was apologetic in the professional way of someone who has learned not to ask questions about the situations that precede his arrival. He had no idea what the legal circumstances were. He was just doing a job. We unloaded what they had taken and brought it back inside, and by 7 that evening, the kitchen looked mostly like itself again. My father's piano was not on the truck. I walked through every room twice looking for it. I called the moving company's dispatch line. After 20 minutes on hold, a supervisor told me that a Steinway upright had been listed on a separate secondary manifest, transferred to a consignment reseller that afternoon. He gave me a name and an address. I drove there the next morning. The piano was in the back of the shop, half covered with a moving blanket, tagged at $1,200. The shop owner was cooperative when I showed him the trust documents and explained that the item had been transferred without legal authority. He called his own attorney, who confirmed what I already knew. He removed the tag. I arranged transport back to the house that afternoon. When the movers set it back in its place against the living room wall, I sat down on the bench and put my hands on the keys and didn't play anything. I just sat there. My father had played this piano badly and joyfully for 30 years, and the memory of that of his completely unself-conscious off-key singing on Sunday afternoons was more present in that moment than anything else in the room. I let myself feel it. Then I got up. 3 weeks later, my stepfather's attorney contacted mine to discuss a potential settlement. My stepfather's position was that the transaction had been executed in good faith based on his interpretation of the power of attorney, that the ambiguity in the document was the source of the error, and that criminal charges were therefore inappropriate. He was willing to pursue full restitution to the investor in exchange for reduced charges. My attorney asked what I wanted. I thought about it. I thought about my father's piano sitting in a consignment shop, tagged at $1,200. I thought about my half-brother's face in the kitchen doorway. I thought about my mother sitting on the floor with an empty wine glass, saying he told me it was standard. "Tell them," I said, "that restitution to the investor is not my decision to make. She is an independent victim with independent counsel. What I want is full accountability in the criminal proceeding. No reduction, no diversion." He knew what that document covered. He is a careful man, who does not make errors of interpretation when the interpretation benefits him. He made this choice. The charges moved forward. 6 months later, my stepfather pled guilty to 1 count of real estate fraud. The wire fraud charge, because it involved the investor's funds rather than mine directly, was handled in a parallel proceeding in which I was a witness rather than a complainant. He was sentenced to 22 months in federal prison and ordered to make full restitution of the investor's funds from personal assets. The investor recovered $260,000 from my stepfather's asset liquidation. The remaining $220,000 remains in civil litigation. She has not yet recovered it in full. She is a woman who skipped a title search to beat the market, and that decision cost her significantly. But the primary responsibility for what happened to her lies with the man who lied to her, not with the process she abbreviated. I said as much when her attorney asked me if I would characterize her conduct as negligent in my deposition. I said, "She made a risky business decision. He made a criminal one. Those are not the same category. My half-brother was not criminally charged. The civil exposure was real, and he settled with the investor for $40,000, the $18,000 he had left, plus a repayment arrangement for the rest." He called me after the settlement was finalized. He said he was sorry again. He said he was going to stop trying to build businesses on other people's money. I told him I hoped that was true. I told him I wasn't ready to rebuild anything yet, but that I wasn't closing the door either. He said that was fair. He said our mother was getting help, that she was seeing a therapist who specialized in financial abuse in long-term partnerships. I said I was glad to hear it. My mother and I are not estranged. We are something more complicated than estranged, which I think is probably accurate to what we actually are to each other. We have lunch occasionally. The conversations are careful and surface level, and occasionally there are moments where she says something that sounds like the person I knew before, and I hold on to those. I don't know yet what we will become. I think that is all right. Some things don't resolve on a clear timeline. The house is mine. The title is still in the trust, and it will stay there. I had a locksmith change every lock the day after the arrest. I repainted the bedroom a different color than it was before I left, because I needed one thing to feel new. I found my father's books at an estate sale across town. Someone had apparently resold a lot from a consignment shop, and I recognized the spines immediately. I bought them all back. I haven't reorganized them yet. I'm waiting until I remember enough of his system to do it right. A lot of people would call what I did the trust, the documents, the waiting a setup. They would say I laid a trap. I've thought about that. And here's what I've decided. I prepared for a contingency that I hoped would never materialize. The fact that it did materialize is not my responsibility. I did not create the conditions that led my stepfather to commit fraud. He created those conditions himself, slowly, over 9 years. I simply made sure I was standing on solid ground when he did. There is a version of this story where I am the villain, the cold, calculating daughter who let a man walk into prison while she watched. I have read that version in the comments of people who think empathy requires you to protect the people who are actively hurting you. I disagree. I think empathy requires you to see people clearly, including the parts of them that are capable of harm. And protecting yourself from harm legally, carefully, without cruelty is not the same as being cruel. My father bought this house when he was 29 years old. He fixed every broken thing in it with his own hands. He played the piano badly in the living room and sang off-key and stacked books in a system no one else could parse. And he loved this house the way people love places that hold the best version of the life they were living. He left it to me because he knew I would take care of it. I took care of it. If you have ever had something that was yours, genuinely, legally, emotionally yours, and had someone try to take it because they assumed you weren't paying attention, drop a comment. I want to know I'm not the only one who had to learn to guard what they love.